and welcome everyone to the very first episode of The Exchange, Conversations for a Better Future. Our topic today, a crisis like no other, exploring the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on inequality and debt. I'm Ravi Agrawal, managing editor of Foreign Policy magazine, and it is my pleasure to be your guest host for the next 45 minutes. As the world navigates the current mode of working from home, the IMF is trying to find new ways for its leadership to have dialogues with key global stakeholders and to do so while still engaging people around the world. And so we have The Exchange, which will feature smart conversations between the IMF's Kristalina Georgieva and other economic or political thinkers. Before I introduce our guests, a few quick words and housekeeping notes. You can tweet along at #IMFExchange. And we've been soliciting your questions online. I have some of the best ones with me, and I'll pose them to our guests towards the end of this event. And since this is the first episode in the series, it only makes sense to begin with the defining event of 2020, the coronavirus pandemic. The world has now recorded more than 17 million cases. The true number of cases is likely far higher. 668,000 people have died of COVID-19, and the global curve has not flattened. Instead, it looks like a plane taking off. Almost every day there are more new cases. While some economies remain suppressed or partially shut down, there are others, especially in the developing world, that have mostly reopened, in large part because their populations can't afford to stay at home and not earn money to put food on the table. The questions I want to explore today are the following. How can the world economy bounce back? What can be done to safeguard the most vulnerable and debt-ridden markets? And a ray of light, is there a chance that the crisis offers the world a chance to build back better? Let's welcome our two guests. Kristalina Georgieva is the managing director of the IMF since last year. She is only the second woman and the first person from an emerging market, Bulgaria, to hold that role. Previously, she spent many years at the World Bank, where she rose up to become vice president. Kristalina, welcome. Good to see you again.
Oh, thank you very much, Ravi. It's great to have you.
And also joining us, indeed, and also joining us today is Ian Bremmer. He is the president and founder of Eurasia Group, a political risk consultancy. He's the author of 10 books and the host of G0 World with Ian Bremmer. Ian, great to see you.
Good to be with you guys.
Okay, let's get started. Kristalina, I'll start with you. Give us a quick overview, if you will, of where the global economy stands today, given the impacts of the pandemic and where you see it headed.
Well, let me give you the highlights. First, as the title of this exchange says it, a crisis like no other. The world economy this year will shrink by almost 5%. Most significantly, it would affect basically almost all countries. 170 countries will end up poorer in December 2020 than they started 2020. Second, response like no other. We have seen tremendous deployment of central bank tools and policy and monetary capacity. And we have seen fiscal measures totaling a staggering $11 trillion. So we are going to lose a lot. In these 2 years, we would lose some 12 trillion, but we have put a floor under the world economy with these very massive measures. And the third is very important, recovery like no other. It is going to be partial, and it is going to be uneven. What does it mean? It means that towards the end of next year, we are not going to be back where we were in 2019. It would be a partial recovery. But most significant, it would be uneven. Different countries, different sectors, at different times. Countries would see ups and they would see downs. And that takes us to two important messages I want to convey to everybody who is willing to listen. First, policymakers have to be very careful not to withdraw support prematurely. It may look like things are getting back to normal, although that is not going to be the case. But there may be reversals, and so we have to be very careful to support the economy. Two, policies have to be agile. We have to adjust to rapidly changing circumstances and do so with a very high degree of uncertainty. And finally, we need to remember this is first and foremost a human crisis, a human tragedy. By now, I don't think there is anybody on this planet that doesn't know somebody who either died or is affected from the unemployment stemming from this crisis. I personally, right now, call every single morning my daughter. She and my grandson are in quarantine. And every day I start with, do you have fever? How do you feel? And that we need to remember has tremendous implications for how we feel, how we are, and hopefully wakes up the good in us, because very clearly we are in this crisis together. We can only get out of it together.
Well said, and I think it's important for policymakers to have a sense of empathy and approach this crisis in that way. Ian, let me bring you in on this. What do you make of the global response in economic terms to the coronavirus so far, and what more needs to be done?
Well, Kristalina put it so clearly. We are all in it together, and we need to respond together. It's an unprecedented crisis. You saw just today a 33% annualized drop in the second quarter of U.S. GDP. That has never been experienced before in recorded history in this country. And I mean, clearly the impact is being felt worldwide. Nobody is immune from it, but we're not actually responding in coordinated fashion. The geopolitics are very dangerous indeed. And it's not that countries are just ignoring each other and working on their own domestic challenges. They're actually blaming each other. The international tensions are growing. And that's particularly clear in the U.S.-China relationship, where the Americans are blaming the Chinese for the original cover-up of coronavirus. They're calling for investigations. The Chinese are blaming the Americans for mishandling the crisis. The level of trust between the world's two largest economies at its lowest point in my lifetime. And on every single issue you could imagine, whether it's the Uyghurs or Hong Kong or Taiwan or intellectual property or Huawei or trade, or the coronavirus, on everything, they're heading in the worst direction, while we're in the middle of the backdrop that Kristalina talks about. We should be all talking about how we work together to get out of this crisis, which is not a matter of months, it's going to be years. And instead, both the domestic politics in many of our countries maximally divisive, but also the geopolitics, both divisive and heading in a worse direction. And so whatever you think about how quickly we will be able to emerge from this crisis economically, you have to add that geopolitical coda, which is going to take longer, and it's going to make it more volatile and challenging.
Kristalina, how many countries have received IMF money? And since we know that countries often complain about the strict terms of IMF loans, do those disbursements come with fewer strings attached?
Well, we are part of this response like no other. We have provided in short 4 months financial lifelines to 75 countries. Never in the history of the IMF we have done so much so fast. And yes, because this is exogenous shock, it is not because countries have messed up their policies. The emergency financing comes with much lighter requirements. We still have to pass safeguards. In other words, is the economic information we receive objectively adequate? And is the country able to repay? In other words, is that sustainable? But once we pass these safeguards, we ask only for 3 things. First, prioritize your health systems. Pay your doctors, pay your nurses, make sure hospitals work. Second, protect the most vulnerable people and the most vulnerable parts of your economy. And third, keep the receipts. Accountability cannot be lost just because we are in a pandemic. And in most countries, very early, we have introduced ex post audits, how the money was used, and we are helping countries to evaluate better the quality of their COVID spending.
Let me ask you both about...
Yep.
Sorry, go ahead, Kristalina.
No, I was just going to say, in addition to emergency financing, we are also providing flexible credit lines for countries with strong fundamentals like Peru, Chile, and we are providing more traditional IMF support. So in total, we have extended, we have a portfolio of $250 billion, 1/3 of it just in this last 4 months. And we have another $750 billion to go, which in this crisis is a comforting position to be.
I want to ask you both about vaccines and just the way in which the world has cooperated so far in how it is developing vaccines and pushing money towards the scientists who need them. Ian, what do you think of the response so far on that front?
Well, first, I want to just a quick response to what Kristalina just said, because for all of the lack of international coordination, it is important to note that neither the Americans, the Chinese, or the Europeans have been trying to undermine the IMF. They've been working with it quite strongly. I mean, everyone criticizes Trump for being a unilateralist. Everyone criticizes him for wanting to undermine NATO. He pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He pulled out of the Paris Peace Accord. He pulled out of the Iranian nuclear deal, the JCPOA. Actually, the headline that never hit is his relationship with the IMF has been extremely functional. His administrations has been very supportive. And, you know, given what Kristalina is saying about just how important the IMF role has been in this crisis, we should be glad for that dog that hasn't barked. So, I mean, it's not like all multilateralism is failing here. I do think when you talk about the vaccine, there's a much greater concern that you've got the Russians saying that they're within a week or two of a Sputnik moment, but they've not shared data with anybody. You've got the Chinese saying they're testing on their military. They haven't been transparent around their data. The Indians also, you know, the United States is working on its own efforts. They've also, the Trump administration bought up all of the remdesivir in terms of treatment available in the world the next 6 months. That's leading to a lot of concern that we could have vaccine nationalism. We could have a war over vaccines. I will say that I'm becoming a little bit less concerned about that because I don't think the vaccine is going to be a silver bullet. In other words, I think that as they roll out, there'll be a number of vaccines that are somewhat successful. They'll come from a lot of different places. They will require not just one vaccine, but booster shots. They will have side effects. Not everyone will be comfortable taking them. In other words, we'll be thinking in 6 months and 1 year's time, we will be thinking of the vaccine as a few arrows in our quiver. And as a consequence, we won't all be fighting over one silver bullet. And in a world that is as fragmented and as politically fraught as the one we have now, frankly, it's a useful thing that we're not looking at one silver bullet vaccine.
I very much agree with Ian that we should have confidence that there will be vaccines coming, but we should not think that there would be a quick, rapid, and universal solution. We will have to work together. And I want to add to his points 2 things. One, universal access to vaccines and treatment. We ought to pursue, in a world where production capacity can be ratcheted up, including in some developing countries, and where the tremendous cost of this pandemic, 12 trillion in 2 years, so much outweighed whatever is the cost of universal access to vaccines and treatment. we have to make sure we have it. It is just common sense. We at the fund are engaging very strongly. By the way, I would add one more snippet of good news, and it is the Europeans, the EU, coming together on the recovery fund, but also coming together on working towards universal access to vaccines and treatment. Many other countries joining that. We have to take this very seriously because whatever is the combination of treatment, if it is only partially available, only to some countries, to some people, the effectiveness of this treatment really goes down dramatically. And that is a theme I really hope our listeners will take with them. It is altruistic, yes, it's a very good thing to have equitable access, but above and beyond, it is in everybody's interest, so we can do it.
Indeed, and supply chains will be a big part of that. We've taken several polls over the last few days of people around the world on some key issues, and I want to slowly start revealing those poll results as they guide us through our discussions. The first question that we asked people on the IMF's social media channels goes, is there a risk that the COVID-19 crisis will aggravate income inequality and existing social tensions? The results, 3% said no, there's no risk. 8% said yes, there's some risk, but it's low. And 89% said yes, there is a high risk. Kristalina, I'd put myself in the third category too, with the majority, in large part because the crisis has dried up work around the world, but especially in the developing world where millions of migrant workers are essentially stranded with no way to make ends meet. How would you assess the risk? Why? But more importantly, what can be done about it?
First, I am in that category, in the vast majority that are very concerned that not only income inequality, but inequality of opportunities, gender inequality can go up unless we act. We know it from prior experiences when we had Zika, when we had H1N1, that inequality went up, and it stayed up especially for people with low skills, low education. So this is really serious. I want to add to that, we kind of forgot what 2019 was all about. It was all about unrest. It was all about people in Chile, people in Lebanon, they are still on the street, in Paris, protesting, mostly because of this sense of inequality. And we, of course, saw racial inequality pushing in the United States millions on the street. This is not going away. In other words, we had this problem before the pandemic. The pandemic can make it worse. What is it that we can do? One, we have to recognize that we will have to redesign our fiscal policies in a way that those that can spare for society a bit more do it. And I'm particularly interested to see how the discussion around digital taxation will advance, because by a long mile, this is the big winner of this pandemic. How is this winner going to help society to be healthier, the social fabric to be stronger? Two, we need to think about the most important investment to make for equality of opportunity, and it is investment in us, in people, in education, in health. If we don't get that message on how important investment in health is with this pandemic, when are we going to get it? And of course, in social protection that is agile and that is not so much about helping people to survive, but it is helping people to help themselves, creating, I call them social safety ropes, opportunities for people to do better. We know these policies work when they are put in place and sustained, and it is now our chance to embrace them. And we need not be in this place of higher inequality and more unrest. I am actually a firm believer in a crisis being our chance to do much better.
Ian, let me bring you in on this. Kristalina touched on sort of taxing the big tech companies. And of course, this week, the CEOs of Facebook, Apple, Amazon, and Alphabet were all defending their records on antitrust issues. It's about tech, but it's also linked to inequality and social tensions. Europe has so far taken the lead over the last few years on this issue. Do you think the US can or will do much?
Europe has taken the lead on that issue, and they're also taking the lead right now on the inequality issue. Angela Merkel, or Ursula von der Leyen. I mean, you're talking about $750 billion, which has been approved, most of which is going to be redistributed from the wealthy European countries to the poorer. It's an incredible success story in a world right now that has very little political leadership. So you're right, Ravi. They've taken the lead in terms of how one should regulate new technology. They're taking the lead on how one should regulate green stimulus and sustainability. Yep. And they're taking the lead in how we should think about transfers and the social contract in dealing with growing inequality. But let's be very clear, Ravi, this is going to get worse. It's going to get worse not only because inequality is being driven harder by coronavirus affecting so badly those that can't socially distance, yep. Those that don't have knowledge economy jobs and have to go to work directly, those that are losing their jobs, but also the acceleration of disruption that comes from technology is growing so fast in this environment. I mean, we've had industrial revolutions in the past. They've led to an enormous growth in wealth. But in Europe, in the United Kingdom, you had 3 generations of workers that were left behind while the elites did much better. This is going to be much harder. And so Kristalina's point that we need to invest in people, because so many people, so many more people will be left behind as a consequence of the massive, the unprecedented technologically driven disruptions that are going to be experienced in the wealthy world and in the emerging markets over the coming 3 years. And if governance does not intervene in the way that the Europeans are presently trying to do domestically, if government doesn't intervene in the United States, in China, and from the advanced industrial economies through the IMF and other organizations to the poorer countries in the world, then the level of social disruption will be unlike anything we've seen in our lifetimes. And those people will react. They'll respond. And that's going to cause much more social disruption. It's going to cause much more violence and revolution. And none of us should want that, but we have to be thinking longer term for these people.
Ravi, can I just interject here one small comment? The 2 names that Ian mentioned, Angela Merkel, Ursula von der Leyen, 2 women. We have seen in this crisis actually that women-led countries, women-led issues seem to fare a bit better. Women seem to be doing actually well. My predecessor in the fund, Christine Lagarde, at the European Central Bank, she's doing really well. I'm not saying men don't have these qualities, but it looks like that in a crisis that has such a tremendous human aspect, the empathy that women bring and the fact that they have more willingness to compromise to bring everybody together is actually a great asset. So I vouch for the women. Being also one of them, I vouch for the women putting not only their minds, but their hearts in what needs to be done.
As do us men too. It's time for our second poll result now. We asked you on the IMF social channels whether rising levels of debt were a serious concern for countries and businesses. 77% said yes, a very serious concern. 14% said it's somewhat serious. 9% said no, it's not that worrying. So once again, a fairly definitive set of responses. It's not a scientific poll, of course, but the IMF has surveyed users on its social media channels. Kristalina, Argentina defaulted in May for the 9th time in its history. Lebanon was forced to restructure its debts back in March. And even before the pandemic really hit the Middle East, that's what happened. Many other countries, Tanzania, Belarus, Pakistan, are all struggling with high levels of debt. What can the IMF do to help, and what can the world do?
Yeah. I mean, the list can go on and on. We can add Ecuador, Angola, Zambia. We do have a situation a little bit similar to inequality. It was high before the crisis, the same way debt levels were high before the crisis. And we would be saying time and again, debt levels are elevated to a point that is dangerous. Now we are in the midst of a crisis, and of course, countries that are stepping in with strong fundamentals are much better off. Those countries were able to return to markets. Once central banks port a lot of liquidity, they can borrow at very low cost. Those that have weaker fundamentals, where debt levels are in distressed territory, they are in very deep trouble. And so what needs to be done, and some of it is being done, some of it will have to be done in the future. Two things. One, for poor countries, it is just unreasonable to expect them, when their economies are in standstill, they're not working, they don't have cushions, they don't have convertible currencies, that they will be able to serve their convertible currencies debts. So David Malpass and I called for a debt service suspension. I'm thrilled the G20 responded, and actually I would add to the list of great achievements of the recent months that Paris Club official creditors and non-Paris Club, China, Gulf countries, they all agreed for this year, 2020, to stop demanding service. So if countries ask for suspension, they get suspension, and some over 40 countries have asked for it. But is it going to be over in the end of the year? Of course not. So I'm saying, and so does David Malpass, and so do advocates on this team, please be rational. The crisis is going nowhere. In 2021, it will be still with us. That initiative has to be extended. Two, debt restructuring, and especially private sector participation. And this is where I'm actually more worried, that we have so far not seen a response of the kind that this crisis requires from the private sector side. And we have to get a way in which we bring the private sector in their own interest, because if we are talking about 2-3 countries and that is being restructured in a hazardous manner, that the world economy can handle. But if we have a wave of unruly restructurings, disorderly defaults, this can put financial stability at risk. So my call is to rationally bring the private sector also into that conversation when it is still early and action can deliver positive results. And of course, we will be supporting through the work we do on debt sustainability analysis. We will be supporting this process, and we are there for countries to help them pursue on a country-by-country basis debt restructuring, like we do right now, supporting with debt sustainability analysis Ecuador. We have done, at the request of Argentina, also debt sustainability analysis for them.
Sure, and those are important words, especially given the role of the private sector in, say, Argentina's default. Ian, let's stay on this, given your expertise in political risk. There's so many countries that have had their finances shredded by the lockdowns. What do you think, broadly, the political repercussions could be, and in which countries do you see those kinds of changes likely to happen first?
I'm not hearing him.
Ian, I think we've lost your audio, so we'll give it a minute before we try and come back to you. Meanwhile, what I'm going to do is take us to our third poll.
I think he
Ian,
came back.
I think we can hear you now. Go ahead. We can. Ian, go ahead.
That's so strange. So, yeah, I was just going to say that clearly they've been able to go to market so far, which is the thing we have to be most positive about, and I think Kristalina and I are both concerned about what happens if that is no longer the case. And she laid out a number of the countries that we'd be most concerned about. I mean, Ecuador wasn't on your original list, but certainly needs to be. There are many others. But one thing that we haven't talked about that I think is worth mentioning is I think China comes out of this crisis in much worse shape than they go in. And I worry about that because, I mean, their corporate debt levels are increasingly very dangerous for them, but they've only doubled down on state capitalism and that inefficiency. They've extended massive amounts of debt to countries around the world that are least capable and will be least capable of actually paying them off through Belt and Road and through other initiatives. Meanwhile, the fights not only with President Trump, but also with other countries around the world, with the Australians, with the UK, with the French, the Germans, the Canadians, increasingly are cutting the Chinese off from having access to the tech and data markets to all of the wealthy countries in the world, which happens to be the area that China is most efficient in terms of their deployment of capital and their returns. So if you look forward over 3-5 years' time, I worry about the sustainability of China's trajectory and China's model. And if it starts to look bad, what do we see politically coming from Xi Jinping? What kind of nationalism? What kind of insecurity? I mean, even now, the steps they've taken with the Indians and the border in the Himalayas, or with Hong Kong and the unilateral introduction of this national security law, an insecure China is a problem for all of us globally. The only thing that would be worse for the U.S. than a successful China is a China that starts to fail, given our level of interdependence. And again, I know Kristalina agrees completely on this point. We've talked about it a great deal in the past. I would start to think about stress test what China starts to look like economically if some of the real concerns about the next 3 years that Kristalina and I have play out for them.
Let's turn now to our final poll result for this event. We asked you on the IMF social channels how optimistic you were that this crisis provides an opportunity for a green, smart, and fair recovery. 31% said they were very optimistic, 44% said they were skeptical, and 25% said the world would return to business as usual. So this time, our results are less definitive than our previous two polls, and the largest group seems to be sitting on the fence. Ian, back in May, you wrote in your weekly note about the possibility of the pandemic being a so-called Goldilocks crisis, not so small that we ignore the deeper lessons to adapt and reform our institutions, but not so big that we're overwhelmed by the damage and can't move on. So 3 months on, what do you think about the chances for creative destruction that is actually useful, and will it be worth it?
The reason to believe that, aside from what we already said about the Europeans, that this could be a Goldilocks crisis, big enough to force us to deal with some of the underlying structural issues, is because even with a 10% contraction of the global economic pie compared to where we would have been, the people that are doing the best, the companies that are succeeding the most, are those most oriented towards innovation and the 21st century. It's the tech firms. I mean, imagine that you had an economic crisis just as big as coronavirus, but instead of a pandemic, it was a massive cyber attack that really that crippled the tech companies and actually empowered the brick and mortar companies. I'd be much more pessimistic in that environment, and our ability to lean into the kind of investments in telemedicine and distance learning and all of the things we're going to need to have a hopeful 21st century that Kristalina was calling for. But I do think that if you look at the United States and China, the two largest economies in the world, and you ask yourself honestly, do we really believe these two governments are going to come through this crisis and address the structural challenges, the various types of kleptocracy that exist in both of their systems, the fact that big pieces of their institutions have been captured in the U.S. by special interests in the private sector, in China by an authoritarian and obscure state sector, that we're really going to start unwinding that, addressing it in a way that benefits the people of those two nations? I think the answer to that is no. And that's a challenge we're going to be dealing with for a long time.
Kristalina, so many people have been using the phrase "Build Back Better." It's a great slogan, but in your mind, what are the one or two specifics that you think countries and organizations such as yours can put in place to actually make that happen?
Well, let me first say that I'm much more attached to build forward better than build back better. I think mentally it creates a better picture. Let me first say, I very much agree with Jan that we have a historic opportunity for transformation towards a digital economy, green economy, and very important, inclusive economy. And it is upon us not to miss it. We know that you take a longer-term perspective, and the arc of history bends towards progress, it bends towards justice. Today, we are sending away Representative John Lewis. In his life, he was part of bending this arc of history in the right direction. And it is painful, but it is possible. So practically, what can be done? Well, three messages. One, we are putting in place a historic in size stimulus, fiscal stimulus. How we use this money to generate more innovation, more equality, green growth is up to us. And decision makers actually know, because we know what the solutions are. We have seen what the Nordics have done for equality. We have seen what countries embracing green growth have done for green jobs, especially in Europe. We know that in the United States and some other parts of the world have taken on a digital transformation driven by private sector. Imagine what it would be if globally we have infrastructure for digital for everyone. Everybody is connected, all businesses, all governments. Imagine the transformation in how governments work. If they're all on an e-platform and citizens can see to the penny how their money is being used, it is possible to do. So this is one, fiscal stimulus, do it right. Two, we have in the next 12 months, 18 months, a chance to get global leadership aligned in a way that was only possible, is only possible after a big shock. Remember the Bretton Woods? Well, now is our moment to reinvent, reimagine the world. And the three I think is very important to put on record. You gave us the number, 31%, yes, we can do it. 44, I think you said, nah, who knows, we are skeptical. And the rest say, no way. We often make a big mistake when we have transformation in front of us. to try to convince everybody come on board. And we spent our time and energy to convince the naysayers, you're wrong. My lesson in my lifetime is focus on those who are the drivers of change. Empower them. Get everybody excited. And then those who are sitting on the bench, I mean, they're now looking this way and that way, and they're saying it may go right, it may go left. Get them to move off the bench and embrace change. Go for it. And I think if we are determined, we have a chance that one day history would be written about this pandemic as being one of the moments where the arc bends even further towards progress and equality. And we can be part of it. We can be part of it.
So we have the crisis, now we need to embrace change.
Optimistic here. I think there are legitimate reasons to be optimistic here. And
go ahead, Ian.
Yeah. I said, I think there are legitimate reasons to be optimistic here. It's funny when you ask, is this going to be a green, smart, and fair recovery? I think, I'm very optimistic. I'm with the 31% that it's going to be green. Because the Europeans are taking the lead, but also the tech firms are taking the lead. And the financial firms are all moving towards more sustainability. And that means that and the young people are all moving in that direction. So, I mean, the folks that are least focused on a green recovery are also the most disempowered. Is it going to be smart? There I'm skeptical because there's not necessarily the alignment between the leaders to move in the same direction, and you need coordination. Some will be smart, some won't. Will it be fair? That's where I think we will return largely to the business as usual, because the inequality is going to be so big, and the big governments are not going to be capable or interested in really responding to it. So frankly, when you ask about green, smart, and fair, I think the 31%, the 44%, and the 25% are actually all correct.
So, following my own logic, I have heard what Ian said on green, and I am not hearing him beyond that. So I embrace that. But on a serious note, it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard work, and it would demand from institutions like mine to be in the weeds with very concrete policy advice. What does it take to have policies that support low-carbon, climate-resilient growth? What does it mean to have everybody with access to the internet? What would it take as public investments? What would it take as private participation? How to get there? And very important, how to put the foundation of a more equitable distribution of the benefits of growth. And actually there we have good examples. We have countries that have done it. We have to get, in our lifetime, we have to get more to join. I'll tell you a small secret. I intend to spend my birthday this year in the place where the Bretton Woods conference happened. I just want to sit there in the room it happened and try to imagine what would it take for the Bretton Woods institutions today to be up to par with the expectations of the people we serve. And hopefully I would come with some inspiration from it.
Let's hope so. We have very little time left, so Ian, I'm just going to jump to some of our audience questions now because we're almost out of time, and I just want to get a couple of them in. There's one issue we haven't talked about, and that's corruption. And David Cheney at the NYU Center for Global Affairs has a question about that, and he says, so much of the emerging market world suffers from poor leadership. Kristalina, I'm going to put this to you. What can international institutions do to help improve the quality of leadership, especially at a time like this?
Two things in our hands to do. One, push for transparency. Transparency is the citizen's best friend. And we do that, we would do more. Two, support institutions to be built that are capable of providing a more inclusive opportunity in development. At the fund, people don't know that, but we have grown a lot in capacity development because we realize that having programs, giving money with institutions that cannot implement these programs is a recipe for a disaster. So our job is transparency and accountability of governments to their citizens and institutions that work for people.
Ian, I have a question for you from Felix Asantem. He's a student at the University of Ghana. And he's talking about how governments in Africa are trying to boost their economy, but at the same time, they have to reduce expenditures given low domestic income flows, especially now with the pandemic. What's your take on that? And also, I want to push you a bit on how Africa has now sort of been confined to China's sphere and what that means for Africa, maybe even some Asian countries.
I'm so glad we're getting a question on Africa in. It's so frequently not a focus of global conversations. I mean, in an environment where, first of all, on the pandemic, the fact that Africa has such a young population and coronavirus hits overwhelmingly the older is actually allowing them to get back on their feet faster than they normally would in a major crisis, and then many other developing countries are around the world. So, I mean, that's frankly a bright spot. I also think that Kristalina's call to invest in human capital, it's very clear when you have a country like Ethiopia with over 100 million African citizens and almost none of them are online. They don't have mobile data. I mean, the educational system, the agricultural system, the healthcare system, you're going to see explosive growth if we can get these people connected, we can get them more digitized. I mean, the next 10 years are going to be all about moving from the internet to the Internet of Things, and the data ecosystems around individual citizens around the world is what's going to drive extraordinary gains in wealth. You get 1 billion Africans and allow them to participate in that market, that's going to drive a lot of growth and opportunity. And it's also going to create much more push for more transparency bottom up in those countries. They're also being hit by climate change much worse than other countries in the world. So the inequalities inside sub-Saharan Africa will be horrifying to deal with. But the opportunities are there. And if any part of the world is going to experience coronavirus as a Goldilocks crisis in 5 or 10 years, I'd put my money on sub-Saharan Africa.
Let's hope so. And what you're describing, Ian, it makes this week's congressional hearings on big tech all the more important so that those countries start off on an equal footing when it comes to the internet. I have time for just one last question. Kristalina, I'm going to put this to you. It's from Joanne Bosworth at UNICEF in New York. And she talks about how developing countries hesitate to call on concessional finance as they believe this will undermine their ratings and ultimately lead to increasing costs of borrowing from the market. So her question is, how do we effectively bring markets into the frame on debt relief?
Let me first say that many developing countries, many countries in sub-Saharan Africa have worked hard to build strong fundamentals and access to markets. And I have full sympathy for that notion. They don't want to go back. They don't want to lose it. And it is very important that as we move forward with the debt service suspension initiative, we are mindful of these concerns and we educate everybody about the notion of this, which is not that debts will not be repaid, but that there would be space for countries to rebuild the economies so they can repay these debts. And that is a message I want to send loud and clear, that we are not advocating for bringing countries back into aid dependency. We are advocating for moving them forward through this crisis with the necessary support. I would say that for countries to be successful, first and foremost, they need to have a medium-term horizon about their fiscal sustainability and their debt sustainability. And I call on countries to be able to project confidence by thinking seriously about how they're going to go on the other side of this crisis. And of course, I also call for being mindful that there are a number of countries where debt restructuring will be a necessity because they have taken debt they simply cannot service anymore, and that these restructurings need to be done in an orderly manner. And my last point on this question would be, for those today that are saying, hey, there is so much liquidity, interest rates are super low, sometimes negative, let's go out there and find riskier investments with higher yield, and are so willing to lend to countries where conditions are not so great. Please be careful. Both lenders and borrowers, do base your decisions on a sound debt management foundation, or otherwise time will come not too far in the future when there may be a huge regret for actions taken today. So
let's hope that doesn't happen. We'll have to wrap here, I'm afraid. Thank you to both of you. We've run out of our allotted time, and thank you to our viewers for bearing with us through some of the technical difficulties we've had. But if you joined in late, a recording of this conversation will be live on the IMF's website, and there'll be many more of these conversations coming up in the months ahead. You can follow the IMF's social channels to stay abreast of the next one. I'm Ravi Agrawal, Managing Editor of Foreign Policy, and once again, a real pleasure to be your host this hour. Thanks for watching, and a big thank you to our guests, Kristalina Georgieva and Ian Bremmer. Terrific insights as always. From me and from the IMF team, stay safe, be well, wear a mask, and thank you.
Thank you, Ravi, thank you, Ian.